In today's video, we travel back 37 years to check out the Games Workshop Citadel Miniatures Spring 1985 Catalog, US Edition. Well, hi folks, and welcome to the channel. I'm Lee, your old hammered host. Today we're going to take a look at a Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures Spring 1985 Catalog, the US Edition. So this is from 37 years ago, back when GW was more focused on things like board games and RPGs than on wargaming. They had published the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy by this point, though it does not seem to be their primary focus. It's kind of relegated to the back of the pamphlet, so we will see it a little bit later. And Warhammer 40k is still a couple of years off, so it's not in here at all. Regardless, this is kind of a fun snapshot of what GW was up to during the mid-1980s, so let's take a look. So here's the upper half of the inside front cover, and I believe all of the board games on this page are products that GW published itself. So in the upper left there we have Apocalypse, the game of nuclear devastation, which was a topic that was on most people's minds back in the 1980s. Then we have Doctor Who, a game of time and space, so even back then GW knew the power of a good IP. There's the Valley of the Four Winds, a hex-based fantasy game pitting the forces of good versus an army of the undead. And then there's Warlock, a card game for 2 to 6 players where wizards duel to the death in an arena of standing stones. On the bottom half of the page we have Judge Dredd the board game, the game of crime fighting in Mega City 1. It'd be fun to make a list of all the Judge Dredd type board games, RPGs, and miniatures games over the years because there's been a bunch of them. Then to the right of Judge Dredd we have Battle Cars, GW's board game of deadly driving. So I believe Battle Cars used cardboard counters, but then just a few years later, in 1988, GW would release Dark Future, which was a full 3D miniatures game using plastic and metal vehicles. In fact, I think there was a Dark Future expansion set, a vehicle expansion set, entitled Battle Cars. Next, on the lower left, we have Talisman, the magical quest game, which was followed by numerous expansions and later editions over the years. And finally, we have Calamity, the international high-risk insurance game, which was written by the famous composer Andrew Lloyd Webber, and nope, I'm not making that up. In addition to the board games, GW was also publishing its own role-playing games. So at the top of this page, we see Golden Heroes, the ultimate in superhero role-playing. So there was a box set with a player's book and a supervisor's book, and then 2 separate sets of miniatures, one for superheroes and one for supervillains. Below that it says Coming Soon, Golden Hero Scenarios, the Golden Heroes supplement called Mega Villains, the Judge Dredd role-playing game, the Judge Dredd scenario Rough Justice, and the Warhammer role-playing game designed to complement GW's Warhammer Battle tabletop wargame. At the bottom of the page we see some startup packages for the play-by-mail games Star Master and Tribes of Crane. I remember Tribes of Crane being advertised in Dragon Magazine. Essentially the premise here is you fill out your turns or whatever and maybe you pay per action, I'm not exactly sure, but you send in your money and your turn sheet to the company. They determine what happens and they send you the results, and then you fill it out again and send them some more money, and then they send you the results. So very much a pre-internet type of endeavor. On the next page we see a variety of RPG accessories for folks who were tired of drawing on graph paper. So there are dungeon floor plans, dungeon planners, wilderness hex sheets, and all kinds of accessories for mapping out your adventure for games of Dungeons & Dragons, Tunnels and Trolls, Rune Quest, Chivalry and Sorcery, is that one? And whatever else people were playing at the time. So this next page is kind of interesting. So I wasn't aware that Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson of GW fame were also involved with the very popular Fighting Fantasy line of adventure books. So obviously, if you have fantasy and sci-fi books, you're going to need cover art, which means you need cover artists. And so I think what this is a series of jigsaw puzzles featuring art by various artists who were involved with the Fighting Fantasy books. Maybe not the exact art on the books, but some of their art out of the portfolio. And finally, on the next to last page, we get to some Citadel miniature box sets and Warhammer Battle. So way back in 1985, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the target market for Citadel Miniatures was mostly RPG players and collectors. And so Warhammer Battle was kind of driven by the miniatures line rather than the miniatures line being driven by the game. I believe this is the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle here, so that was kind of a box set with 3 books for combat, battle magic, and the battle bestiary. Below that is a reference to the Citadel Compendium, which was kind of an irregular publication put out to promote Citadel products as opposed to everybody else's products. Here's a list of some of the main categories that Citadel organized their miniatures into. They had over 1,000 different figures at this point. Plus, they had been appointed the exclusive manufacturer in the US and Europe of Dungeons & Dragons and AD&D gaming miniatures. So, good on them. Then on the back cover of the catalog, we see a plug for White Dwarf Magazine, which at the time covered a lot of different games, including AD&D, Warhammer, Traveller, RuneQuest, Gamma World. So again, primarily RPGs, and many of them from other manufacturers. So anyway, that is the Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures Spring 1985 Catalog, US Edition, which was published 10 years after the company's founding back in 1975. So it's kind of fun to see how in just one decade, they went from being an importer of other companies' games to being a developer of their own products and their own IPs. And of course, over the decades that followed, they would take that much further. All right, folks, that is a wrap on today's historical journey back to the magical year of 1985. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back soon with some more tabletop wargaming goodness. But until then, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.